The arrogant young co-pilot laughed as he had the elderly passenger escorted out of first class. He told the man that first class was reserved for people who actually mattered. He pointed toward the back of the plane and told him to sit with the rest of the ordinary people where he belonged. What the co-pilot did not know was that the quiet old man in the worn cardigan was not just a passenger in 40,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean with both engines on fire and the aircraft in a violent uncontrolled dive. That single act of arrogance was going to be the most catastrophic mistake of his entire life. Ryan Calder was 26 years old and had been flying commercially for less than 18 months. He had graduated top of his class from flight school, which he never let anyone forget. He wore his uniform like a suit of armor, every button perfectly polished, every crease razor sharp. He walked through airports with his chin slightly elevated, his jaw set, radiating the kind of confidence that very young men mistake for competence. Ryan believed that flying was about authority, about control. The cockpit was his domain, the aircraft was his kingdom, and every single person who stepped through the boarding door was a passenger in his world. He tolerated them the way a king tolerates peasants barely. The flight was transatlantic flight 447 departing London Heathrow bound for New York. It was a full aircraft, 312 passengers packed into the long-haul Boeing 777. The first-class cabin was small and exclusive, only 12 seats arranged in private pods along the forward section. Ryan was moving through the first-class cabin 20 minutes before departure, doing a routine walk-through when he noticed the old man. He was sitting in seat 3A, the prime window seat. He looked to be in his late 60s, perhaps early 70s. He was wearing a plain gray wool cardigan over a simple white collared shirt. His trousers were clean but unremarkable. He wore no tie, no watch worth noticing, no designer luggage in the overhead bin. He had a battered soft leather satchel at his feet and a worn paperback book open in his hands. His name was Edward. Edward had been flying for over 40 years, not as a passenger but as a pilot for 3 decades. Edward had been the chief flight training officer for one of the largest commercial aviation companies on the planet. He had personally trained over 4,000 pilots. He had logged more than 38,000 hours of flight time across 6 continents, including combat missions. During his early military career, he had safely landed a crippled aircraft on a highway in a snowstorm. He had guided a burning regional jet to an emergency landing in a field with no runway lights and no functioning hydraulics. Edward was the kind of man who existed in aviation legend. His name was in the textbooks. His emergency procedures were printed on laminated cards bolted to cockpit walls across the industry. He had retired the previous year quietly without ceremony because Edward had never wanted ceremony. He had simply handed in his license, packed his leather satchel, and bought a first-class ticket to New York to visit his daughter and his 3 grandchildren. He was reading a novel about the Roman Empire when Ryan stopped at row 3. Ryan looked at the old man, he looked at the cardigan, he looked at the battered satchel, he looked at the paperback novel. Ryan's face tightened in his mind. First class was a visual statement. It was champagne and designer carry-ons and people who looked important. The old man in the gray cardigan disrupted the aesthetic. He looked like someone who had wandered in from economy by mistake. Ryan cleared his throat and said, "Sir, excuse me." Edward looked up from his book and said, "Yes." "Can I see your boarding pass?" Ryan asked. Edward set his book down calmly and pulled the boarding pass from between the pages where he had been using it as a bookmark. He handed it to Ryan. It was perfectly valid, C3, a first class, fully paid. Ryan studied it for a longer time than necessary. He handed it back with a tight, thin smile and asked if there was a particular reason Edward had chosen first class for this flight. Edward blinked and said, "I am sorry." Ryan lowered his voice, but not by much, and said, "First class is generally booked by our business clients, corporate travelers, executives, people with specific status requirements. It is not typically the choice for leisure travel." Edward studied the young co-pilot for a moment. He had encountered arrogance before. In 30 years of aviation, he had met pilots who confused their uniform for their character. He recognized the type immediately. "I assure you, young man," Edward said, his voice perfectly even, "my ticket is valid, my seat is paid for, and I am not inconveniencing anyone." Ryan said, "I am going to have to ask you to move to economy. We have a corporate group that needs the forward cabin reconfigured. We will arrange a full refund for the class difference." This was a complete lie. There was no corporate group, there was no reconfiguration. Edward looked at Ryan for a long moment. He could see exactly what was happening. He had watched young men like Ryan for decades, men whose confidence was a costume, men who had never truly been tested. Edward did not argue. He did not demand to speak to a supervisor. He simply picked up his leather satchel, tucked his Roman Empire novel under his arm, and walked quietly toward the back of the aircraft. Ryan watched him go, adjusted his epaulets, and went back to the cockpit feeling like he had successfully maintained order. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 8:43 in the morning. The weather was clear over London. The crossing was forecast to be smooth. For the first 4 hours it was. Edward sat in his economy seat near the back of the aircraft reading his book, drinking his tea and watching the clouds through the small oval window. He was not angry, he was simply tired, the way a man gets tired when he has watched the world repeat the same mistakes for too long. Then approximately 4 hours and 17 minutes into the flight, somewhere over the middle of the Atlantic, the aircraft entered the edge of a severe convective cell that had not appeared on the pre-flight weather charts. The turbulence hit without warning, not mild turbulence but violent structural turbulence, the kind that throws unsecured objects across cabins and bruises passengers against their seatbelts. In the cockpit, Captain Helen Marsh, the aircraft commander, immediately called for the seatbelt sign and reduced speed. She was experienced, 15 years of long-haul flying, solid and unflappable. She and Ryan worked through the procedure calmly. Then the number 2 engine surged. A bird strike, or more accurately a dense flock of migrating birds at a freak altitude, had been ingested into the right engine during the turbulence encounter. The compressor blades shattered, the engine went into an immediate uncontained failure. The noise was enormous, a deep resonating boom followed by a high-pitched screaming tear that passengers in the rear of the aircraft felt in their chests. Captain Marsh immediately began the engine failure checklist. Then the fire suppression system for engine 2 malfunctioned. The fire continued burning, the heat transfer into the wing structure began. Then engine 1 began to surge. The bird flock had entered both engines in the span of 7 seconds. Captain Marsh declared an emergency. She called Mayday. She began the dual engine failure procedure. Ryan Calder froze. It was not a dramatic freeze. He did not scream, he did not faint, he simply disconnected from the moment. His hands were on the controls, but he was not processing. His training existed somewhere in the back of his mind, but it felt impossibly distant, like trying to read words through frosted glass. He had practiced dual engine failures in a simulator exactly twice. Both times the simulator had been paused and reviewed in a calm, classroom setting. This was not a simulator. The aircraft was descending, the altimeter was unwinding, the cockpit was filled with alarm tones, fire warnings, hydraulic pressure alerts. Captain Marsh was working furiously, but dual engine failure over open ocean with a wing fire was catastrophically complex. She needed her co-pilot to be her second brain, reading checklists, managing radio calls, monitoring secondary systems. Ryan was breathing, but he was not functioning. Ryan, Marsh said sharply, engine 2 fire checklist now. Ryan picked up the laminated checklist card. His hands were shaking so badly he could not read the text. In the cabin, the passengers knew the aircraft was not simply bouncing through turbulence. The angle was wrong, the descent rate was wrong, the sound was wrong. Oxygen masks had dropped, people were crying, people were praying. A child in row 24 was screaming for her mother. Edward set his book down. He had felt the engine failure before he heard it. The vibration pattern through the airframe was unmistakable. He had recognized the dual engine surge from the noise profile and the change in yaw. He had felt the wing fire in the heat shimmer outside his window. He stood up, stepped into the aisle, moved calmly to the forward galley and pressed the cockpit call button. A flight attendant grabbed his arm and told him he could not go to the cockpit and to return to his seat immediately. "Get your senior flight attendant," Edward said quietly. "Tell her that the aircraft commander needs immediate assistance. Do not argue with me, every second matters." Something in his voice caused the flight attendant to release his arm and reach for her interphone. 15 seconds later, the senior flight attendant arrived. She looked at the old man in the gray cardigan standing in her galley with her aircraft in a crisis dive, and she opened her mouth to tell him to sit down. "My name is Edward Calloway," the old man said. "I spent 30 years as chief flight training officer at Meridian Aviation. I have 38,000 flight hours. I trained the people who trained your pilots. The commander needs a second qualified pilot in that cockpit in the next 60 seconds, or this aircraft will not reach the water in a recoverable configuration. Open the door." The senior flight attendant stared at him for exactly 1 second. She opened the door. Edward stepped into the cockpit. Captain Marsh had her hands full of aircraft. She barely had time to look up, but she heard the voice. "Helen," Edward said from the jump seat behind her. "I am Edward Calloway. I am rated on type. Ryan, I need you to move to the observer seat right now." "Helen, I am with you." Captain Marsh had been in aviation long enough to know the name Edward Calloway. Every serious commercial pilot knew that name. She had studied his emergency landing procedures in training. She had read his published papers on engine failure management over open ocean. "All yours, Edward," she said without hesitation. Ryan stared at the old man from the cardigan, being asked by his captain to move aside. His mouth opened and closed. "Move, son," Edward said gently, not cruelly, not with satisfaction, just firmly, the way a man speaks when there is no time left for anything except the task. Ryan moved. Edward sat in the right seat. His movements were completely calm, completely economical. He looked at the instrument panel the way a craftsman looks at a familiar workbench. He assessed the situation in perhaps 8 seconds. Helen, I am going to suggest we forget the Atlantic divert and look at the Azores. We have enough hydraulics. If we manage the descent rate, I will take primary, you manage communications and secondary systems. Agreed, Marsh said. Edward's hands moved. He spoke in a low, steady, rhythmic voice, walking through procedures that were to him as natural as breathing. He reduced drag configuration. He optimized the glide ratio with no engine power. He managed the residual hydraulic fluid in the system with almost surgical precision, rationing what remained for the approach and the landing flare. He talked to air traffic control in the same tone a man might use to order coffee. He guided the aircraft through the last of the turbulence with adjustments so smooth that the passengers in the cabin, still weeping, still clutching each other, felt the aircraft steadying beneath them. 41 minutes after the engines failed, transatlantic flight 447 landed on runway 30 at Lodges Field in the Azores. The landing was not a crash, it was not a miracle in the dramatic sense, it was the precise, controlled professional work of a man who had spent 40 years mastering the exact moment that had just occurred. The aircraft rolled to a stop. The emergency services already waiting surrounded the aircraft. The fire in the right wing was extinguished. For a moment the entire cabin was completely silent. Then it erupted. 312 people who had been certain they were going to die began screaming with relief. They were crying, laughing, hugging strangers, calling family members with shaking hands. In the cockpit, Captain Marsh sat back in her seat and exhaled for what felt like the first time in 41 minutes. She turned to Edward and said nothing for a moment, then she said simply, "Thank you." Edward nodded. He reached behind the seat and picked up his leather satchel and his Roman Empire novel. Outside the aircraft, a black SUV had arrived ahead of the emergency vehicles. From it stepped the director of operations for the airline, who had been tracking the emergency from London from the moment the Mayday call went out. He had recognized the registration and the route instantly when the name Edward Calloway appeared on the passenger manifest. He had personally boarded a company jet. The forward boarding door opened. The director of operations stepped inside. He walked past the flight attendants. He walked past the passengers who were still collecting their things with trembling hands. He walked to the cockpit door. He looked at Ryan Calder sitting in the observer seat, his perfectly pressed uniform completely destroyed by 4 hours of cold sweat. The director looked at Edward Calloway in the right seat in his gray cardigan with his leather satchel on his knee. The director of operations, one of the most powerful men in global commercial aviation, removed his jacket, stood at full attention and bowed his head. "Captain Calloway," he said, "I do not have adequate words." Edward stood up, patted the man on the shoulder and moved toward the exit door. Ryan Calder stepped forward, his voice cracking, and said, I need to say something. I am sorry, I did not know who you were. I thought you were just an old man. I was wrong." Edward stopped. He turned and looked at the young co-pilot. Ryan was expecting anger. He was expecting the devastating judgment of a man who had every right to deliver it. Edward looked at him for a long moment and said, "You froze today. That is not a character flaw, that is a training deficit, but the way you treated me before we left the ground, that was a character flaw, and the two things together, Ryan, tell you everything you need to know about where your work needs to happen." Edward looked out the cockpit window at the island runway, the foam-covered tarmac, the fire trucks. "Being a pilot," he said quietly, "is not about the uniform. The uniform is the last thing that matters. Do you understand?" Ryan nodded. He could not speak. Edward Calloway picked up his novel, tucked it under his arm, and walked off the aircraft into the warm Azores morning to find a telephone and call his daughter to let her know he would be a little late.